Bueno, muy buenos días. Les damos la bienvenida por haber llegado, a quienes están acá presentes físicamente y a los cientos de personas que nos estarán mirando desde otras partes de la región de América Latina. Bueno, en realidad son 4, pero se habían inscrito más, así que esperamos que se vayan sumando a lo largo de la mañana, del mismo modo que esperamos que vayan llegando otras personas que se registraron. No es fácil llegar acá, por las cuestiones que ustedes bien conocen, los locales. Así que bueno, nos vamos a dar el tiempo de que en esta introducción la gente se vaya sumando y a fin de no dilatar más los horarios de inicio y por respeto a todos y todas las personas que han llegado a horario, vamos a tratar de respetar los tiempos. Bueno, el motivo del encuentro ustedes ya lo conocen, es este coloquio sobre metodologías de investigación participativa orientados a adolescentes LGBT. Y esto es parte de un proyecto general en el cual FLACSO Argentina se asocia con una universidad de Inglaterra, la Universidad de Lancaster concretamente, para justamente analizar temáticas vinculadas con la salud mental de la población adolescente LGBT en el contexto del sistema educativo. Y esto es producto también de una negociación que lleva casi un año, que implicó un conocimiento de los distintos equipos de trabajo, pese a que ya existía una relación precedente a través de la presencia de Andrew Clarke, que está aquí presente y ya la van a conocer en una de sus exposiciones, que es un especialista en salud pública, orientado a temas de niñez, adolescencia, y que recientemente se ha mudado, ha cambiado de sombrero institucional, y está trabajando como asesor senior en Save the Children en Inglaterra. Y para que tenga una idea, el periplo que ha hecho Andrew es un poco atípico, porque acaba de venir de Nairobi y de acá se va a Sierra Leona y después al Yemen. O sea, un poco para que vean cuál es el esquema ordenado de viajes que tiene. O sea que en su cabeza obviamente corren muchas realidades y circunstancias que lo hacen justamente tener una visión muy particular de lo que está aconteciendo en el contexto de la niñez, fundamentalmente de la perspectiva de los derechos. Y en este sentido, esto está enmarcado en un proyecto de investigación que está en crecimiento. Y bueno, y durante esta semana hemos tenido algunas actividades que luego van a conocer en detalle. O sea, ha sido una semana muy, muy intensa de trabajo y pensábamos que era muy importante aprovechar esta visita para socializar y compartir la posibilidad de tener este equipo de investigadores e investigadoras para que de alguna manera la audiencia local pueda también disfrutar de los conocimientos y, por qué no, también promover un diálogo y un intercambio y un debate entre todos quienes estamos aquí. Hola, buen día. Entonces, les voy a explicar brevemente nuestra mecánica de trabajo. Si bien esta actividad ustedes saben que está auspiciada, patrocinada por dos programas de acá de FLACSO, fundamentalmente el programa de Ciencias Sociales y Salud, que coordino, mi nombre es Raúl Mercer, y el programa de Educación, que está representado en este caso por Dora Niedviecki, que no sé si en algún momento se va a sumar acá, pero sirve este momento para hacer un paréntesis y un agradecimiento muy especial al equipo de trabajo. Me estoy refiriendo concretamente a Carlota Ramírez, a Karina Simino, a Pilar Basile, a Dora Niedviecki, ¿me olvido de alguien más? A Blas Reddy, a Valeria, que está, bueno, está acá presente, a Marina Elichiri, no está acá, ¿no? La conocemos virtualmente. O sea que esto es un poco para que vean que el resultado de este trabajo no es producto de una responsabilidad única, sino que hay un equipo que estuvo trabajando y que realmente se puso, dio tiempo al tiempo para que estas cosas puedan concretarse. Hechas estas introducciones, simplemente comentar la metodología de trabajo. Nosotros le vamos ahora en un minuto a darle pie al resto del panel de apertura para que haga su presentación. Vamos a tener dos exposiciones. La primera a cargo de Mark, y una vez que finaliza la exposición abrimos un espacio de debate que va a estar de alguna manera regulado en cuanto al manejo de los tiempos. y un segundo momento a cargo de Liz con un debate ulterior. Y para esto lo que vamos a pedir es que nos manden en forma, para la gente que está conectada virtualmente, capturaremos los aportes desde el chat y los traduciremos en forma escrita para que lo tome el panel. Y para ustedes, obviamente, lo podrán hacer en forma directa con el panel al final de cada exposición. El primer panel va a estar moderado por Carlota, y un segundo momento en donde vamos a tener la participación de Alex con su presentación y un momento de debate, y luego una presentación de Andrew también con un momento de debate. Esta es la metodología, y entre ambos paneles vamos a tener un momento de relax para que cada quien haga lo que desee. Así que este es un poco el sentido de la actividad. Esta actividad está siendo video grabada, así que luego vamos a poder tener acceso a este material como recurso para ver todas las cosas que se dijeron y que por la celeridad de los intercambios los vamos perdiendo, pero además como potencial recurso docente o pedagógico para las actividades que estén desarrollando en distintas partes, pensando que esto también es una fuente de conocimiento interesante como objeto de análisis. Así que estas aclaraciones, ¿vamos bien? ¿Sí? Le damos entonces la palabra a nuestro director, a Alberto Quevedo, Beto, para que haga justamente la apertura formal de la actividad.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, Raúl. Bueno, buenos días a todas y todos. Además de darle la bienvenida a quienes estamos acá presentes en la sede de la FLACSO Argentina, también saludar a toda la gente que nos sigue vía internet, y al equipo nuestro de educación a distancia y de FLACSO virtual que coopera con nosotros, así que muchísimas gracias. Darles la bienvenida a todos y todas, pero quiero subrayar algo, que es la bienvenida a nuestros colegas, amigos de la Universidad de Lancaster. Desde que Raúl nos informó sobre este proyecto, a nosotros nos alegró mucho poder tener esta asociación con la universidad. Darles además la bienvenida a trabajar en conjunto en un proyecto que para FLACSO resulta especialmente importante, y porque tiene algo del espíritu con el cual esta institución nació. FLACSO nació con una idea de trabajar los problemas de América Latina de manera regional, tomando no solamente las temáticas propias locales de la Argentina, sino también tomando las temáticas que tienen que ver con nuestro continente, y hacerlo también de manera innovadora, es decir, estando muy atentos a lo que son la aparición de los fenómenos sociales, políticos, económicos, culturales de la región. Y el tercer elemento que forma parte del espíritu de FLACSO es hacerlo en sociedad, asociándonos con instituciones prestigiosas, con instituciones universitarias, académicas prestigiosas, con experiencia también en estas temáticas, como en este caso la Universidad de Lancaster, pero hacerlo focalizando en la capacidad que tengamos, no solo de investigar, de producir conocimiento, de tener proyectos comunes, sino además de incidir en las políticas públicas. O sea, de sumar en esto también a quienes son los responsables de las políticas públicas. Por eso, yo sé que en estos días, por iniciativa justamente de Raúl y de Dora, que forma parte también de esta asociación dentro de FLACSO, ustedes han tomado contacto con instituciones del gobierno nacional y del gobierno local y de organizaciones de la sociedad civil. Y lo que les quería transmitir es que ese espíritu de trabajo con perspectiva regional, con la capacidad que tengamos de asociarnos para hacer en conjunto, llevar adelante en conjunto proyectos, y como como corolario de esto, para incidir, para proponer, para estar atento a lo que son las políticas públicas, forman parte de la esencia de FLACSO, son nuestro espíritu. Así que no solo darles la bienvenida y agradecerles que estén acá, sino además decirles que estamos orgullosos de que este proyecto sigue esa tradición de FLACSO. La segunda cosa que les quería decir es que para nosotros el trabajar en conjunto dentro de la institución es muy importante. Entonces, allí Raúl y todo su equipo de Ciencias Sociales y Salud ha convocado a otras áreas de FLACSO, ¿no? Al área de educación, por un lado, al IICSAL, que es nuestro centro de doble pertenencia de investigación con el CONICET, y al doctorado, y por eso está Pedro acá, que forman parte pilares importantes de esta institución. O sea que nuestro orgullo de este proyecto está también de que este proyecto pudo tejer, coser distintas áreas, programas y proyectos de la FLACSO. Y en cuanto a lo regional, también sabemos que la convocatoria logró sumar iniciativas similares que hay en Chile, en Colombia, en Uruguay, en Paraguay, en Perú. Eso es la FLACSO, digamos, pensar Latinoamérica desde Latinoamérica y pensar que los problemas que tratamos acá en Argentina, en este caso los problemas de los jóvenes LGTB en su relación con la escuela en particular, pero no solo eso, sino su relación con la sociedad, con la cultura de esta época, son comunes a muchas de las realidades de los países latinoamericanos y son comunes a muchas de las realidades de otros países como el Reino Unido, digamos, donde también se viven este tipo de demandas y nuevas problemáticas desde la sociedad. Yo, además de darles la bienvenida y de felicitarlos a los equipos y de agradecerles que me permitan estar acá en esta apertura, quiero decirles que sabemos que este proyecto tiene como propuesta continuar trabajando para formar un proyecto regional que se pueda prolongar en los próximos años con tareas de investigación, de intervención, etc. Y quiero decirles que sepan que van a contar con todo el apoyo de FLACSO Argentina y todo lo que podamos hacer desde el sistema FLACSO. Nosotros somos 14 sedes en 14 países de América Latina. Vamos a cooperar con el desarrollo de este proyecto. Así que les deseo un buen trabajo en el día de hoy. Los felicito por estos varios días de trabajo que han tenido ya aquí en Argentina, pero lo más importante es que estoy seguro que vamos a poder seguir trabajando en el futuro. Muchísimas gracias.
Una aclaración. Muchas gracias, Beto, realmente por tus palabras y aparte por el apoyo que no es de este proyecto, es un apoyo permanente que tenemos de parte de la institución, ¿no? Una aclaración que es que la actividad después va a ser en inglés y el motivo no es una cuestión de colonialismo lingüístico, sino es porque no tenemos dinero para hacer la traducción. O sea, simplemente queremos hacer esta aclaración. Y en sintonía y en línea con lo que nos venía planteando el director, la presencia del doctorado de FLACSO en la voz de Pedro Núñez, que es justamente el director del doctorado en Ciencias Sociales de acá de FLACSO, le vamos a dar un espacio también para que haga sus comentarios relativos al evento.
¿Qué tal? Buenos días a todas, todos. Gracias, Raúl, Beto, por la invitación. Es un gusto enorme acompañarlos esta mañana. Para nosotros desde el doctorado, la oportunidad de tomar contacto con investigaciones, con investigadores e investigadoras de distintos países es un aspecto central de nuestra propuesta. A partir del momento en que Raúl nos convocó a sumarnos, él sabe, y todo su equipo, que nosotros también tenemos una preocupación central en cuanto a los temas de género. no solo porque muchos de nuestros doctorandos y doctorandas lo toman como problemática, sino porque una de las cuestiones centrales que queremos plantear desde el programa de doctorado es precisamente la intención de instalar temas de agenda desde las investigaciones, la incidencia en las políticas públicas, como bien mencionaba Beto anteriormente, hasta el punto que en este momento tenemos 2 personas que están cursando y que obtuvieron una beca que llamamos Claudia Pía Baudraco, que era una activista trans, que organizamos junto con la Subsecretaría de Diversidad Sexual de la provincia de Santa Fe y la Federación LGBTQ de la Argentina, lo cual para nosotros es importante no solo por la posibilidad de que personas puedan realizar el doctorado, sino porque creemos sinceramente que ahí hay una manera de incidir desde la academia en las temáticas relevantes y las que deben ser discutidas. Nuestra sociedad es una sociedad compuesta por múltiples identidades que se articulan de manera plural, y algo de eso se refleja también en el doctorado. Tenemos personas de distintos países con distintos intereses y perspectivas de estudio, y no buscamos homogeneizar, sino que nos parece precisamente que esa diversidad de temáticas, de intereses, es lo que enriquece la posibilidad de trabajar juntos. Así que sumarnos a este tipo de actividades, la mirada interdisciplinaria, la perspectiva regional, son todos aspectos que nos parecen centrales y que creo que este proyecto se enmarca dentro de esos intereses. Felicitar a Raúl y su equipo, que ha logrado que ustedes, espero, se sientan cómodos durante su estancia en Buenos Aires, lo suficientemente alejados de su país como para conocer realidades diversas, y también lo suficientemente cercanos que hasta ha logrado que llueva hoy, ¿no? Ha hecho un mérito fundamental. Así que estamos muy contentos. Cierro con una mínima reflexión. Beto decía algo en relación al futuro, ¿no? Siempre la expectativa es no solamente cuando uno se encuentra en este tipo de espacios, es disfrutar de este presente y del momento y del intercambio que vamos a tener a partir de las exposiciones de los colegas, sino fundamentalmente pensar algo que nosotros sostenemos, y que es que mañana va a ser mejor, es decir, todo lo que a partir de ahora se abre en cuanto a posibilidades de intercambio, de continuar pensando proyectos de investigación, de profundizar los lazos entre realidades que pueden parecer lejanas y ajenas, pero que tienen muchos más puntos en común de los que uno muchas veces puede imaginar. Así que felicitarlos e instar a seguir pensando juntos. Me parece que los desafíos que tenemos como sociedades, los desafíos que tenemos desde el mundo académico, de las políticas públicas, requiere de este esfuerzo de articulación y de precisamente disfrutar, divertirnos y aprender pensando juntos. Así que bienvenidos y bienvenidas.
Gracias, Pedro. Bueno, hechas estas presentaciones, pasamos del acto formal de apertura al momento académico también tan esperado. Vamos a invitar a Carlota, a Liz y a Marc para que se acerquen acá.
Bueno, buenos días todos y todes. Me toca el privilegio de presentar a los 2 expositores de la mañana y de haber tenido el privilegio también de disfrutar una semana muy intensa de mucho aprendizaje con los colegas y las colegas. Y para iniciar este panel vamos a darle la palabra a Marc Limmer. Marc Limmer es investigador y profesor de la Universidad de Lancaster en el Departamento de Equidades en Salud. además de ser un actor clave en este proyecto, se dedica a sus temas de interés, son, bueno, las inequidades en salud, temas de los colectivos LGTB, pero tiene un particular interés también en las masculinidades y la construcción de las masculinidades y las nuevas masculinidades con miras a pensar en sociedades más igualitarias desde la perspectiva de género. Así que no voy a tomar mucho tiempo en las presentaciones para que dispongamos de ese tiempo para escuchar a Marc.
Good morning, and first of all, apologies for the fact that we're all going to have to speak English. I think we've been slightly humbled by how poor our Spanish is compared with your English, so apologies. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Will you wave if I go quiet? So my intention this morning is to share with you some thoughts and ideas I have in relation to my work on masculinities, but very much in the spirit of sharing, and I'll be really interested to hear how this, how much you agree, how much you disagree with what I'm saying, and for me, one of the important things is we have an ongoing dialogue and conversation about how masculinities for young people move forward. So these are some thoughts. I've worked with young men for about 30, probably more, 30 years. In many different ways, initially as a youth and community worker, and then working in sexual health and working in HIV, and then more latterly in policy and research. And I think I bring in this presentation my thoughts that are directed from all of those sources. But I start from here. This was me, aged 15, very attractive young man, unsurprisingly at this point a virgin. But I think what's really important about showing you this picture, I think, is for me the starting point if we're going to work with young people about their masculinities as men, is just to remember as much as we can what that experience of being young is like. And in the UK, we spend a lot of time, and I think I'll spend some time this morning, talking about the problems of masculinities, the problems that young men cause or are seen to cause. But when I was 15, that's not how I saw myself. That wasn't my understanding. At that time, I was excited to be young. I was wanting to explore. I was frightened by lots of things that were around me, and it was a time of constant change and difference for me. And I think sometimes we have to remind ourselves, I think that is what young men are going through. We're not, some of the responses and behaviours that young men are involved in are a product of being young and a product of that. And so I like to share that. Well, I don't like to share that picture, but I share that picture just to remind myself and us what it is that we're talking about. But I'm interested. So I've got two screens here, so I'm mainly interested, I think, in this talk is just saying a little bit about masculinities and working class masculinities. So masculinities in relation to so people who are living in deprived and poorer areas, particularly in the UK. And this was a quote from Martin Mackengale in about 20 years ago, who summed up what he thought young masculinities' interests were. And he described that as the 3 Fs, and he described that as fighting, fucking, and football. And I think that's, part of me thinks that's quite a neat summing up. And when you talk to young men, that's quite often what their preoccupations are. But I also think it massively undersells the complexity and interests of young men. But it has been in the UK thinking a really strong discourse that actually these are the things that interest young men, and that those are problematic, and therefore young men are a problem that need to be solved. And I think in terms of, I'm going to be more interested in this talk on the middle F, on the fucking one. I'll probably just say sex now. But as a point of interest, and I think particularly in terms of sex, young men have been positioned as problematic. And also in this, and it'll be reflected, I think, in this talk, that young men in the discourses on mainstream masculinities are also heterosexual. That's where the focus has been on men. That actually the expectation of heterosex for men is incredibly strong, and I think we reinforce that in how we talk about all the assumptions we make about young men. And so part of, I think, this talk is reflecting on that, and partly is looking at how that assumed heterosexuality actually starts to affect how men behave with each other. So this is what the kind of things I just want to cover, and I can't even see that from here, so I'll quickly go. I just want to say a little bit about hegemonic masculinities. Not very much, but I think that for me that's a good place to start in thinking about masculinities. I want to say a little bit about what in the UK we have as the ideal of the perfect sexual man. And I've done quite a lot of research in the past about what young men describe as the perfect sexual man as well, so I'll reflect a little bit on that. I want to reflect a little bit on what happens when sex goes wrong, so for young men, how they respond to that. And then I want to say a little bit about, I think, a quite worrying trend in the UK, or worrying discourse in the UK around masculinities, which is kind of suggesting, I think, an artificial shift in masculinities. But I'll come back to that. And also then I want to just finish by just thinking about when we're engaging with young men, we have to try and move beyond seeing young men as either vulnerable or a threat, and having some greater complexity in how we think about young men. So I'll start with just some very brief thoughts about hegemonic masculinities. I don't know how aware people are of masculinities theories, or indeed how interested. But the idea broadly of hegemonic masculinities is that there is a way of being a man that is accepted universally across most of, usually described as a developed world, which is a very unhelpful definition. But there's an ideal of what constitutes being a man, and that's about wealth. It's about power. It's about status. It's about heterosexuality, it's around sexual veracity. So a whole range of things that are presented to men as what we should be. None of us are. None of us ever would be, and it's not an ideal I don't think anyone's expected to meet. But it's a very powerful expectation on young men about how they should be seeking to behave, and what will constitute being a good man. But under that, and I think one of the themes for what I want to talk about is there's this idea that there are subordinated and marginalized masculinities, some forms of masculinities which are always going to be considered lesser. And into that, I think the non-heterosexual men will be seen in these hierarchies as lesser, such that, and the same you could say for men of colour or other groups, such that actually whatever achievement those men make, they're never going to reach that ideal. So there's that level, but there's also another level of marginalisation for masculinities, which are those which are a product of some more social factors, so things like deprivation and poverty and those things that become barriers to ever achieving masculinities. I think it's important to try and pick up on those. The other very quick thing I want to say about masculinities is, in this theory, masculinity is about what we do as men. It's not who we are. This is not about our bodies. It's not about anything. This is about, masculinity is about what we do. It's about practices, and that those practices will change in different times and spaces. Different practices are allowable, are accepted in different places. And I think it's really important that we understand that fluidity. And also that within that masculinities are to some degree a performance. We're doing something. And that a performance has an audience. And who that audience is and how that audience responds to us is incredibly powerful. So one of the ways that I'll explain this slide. I couldn't make it any big. No, I'll show it to you there. One of the things that I've been struggling to understand, I think, is in the UK we see. I come from a health background, and in health we see far poorer health outcomes for particular groups of young men. Okay? And we're trying to understand that from a kind of masculinities perspective. It's been quite difficult, and I'm not sure that we've been necessarily very good at it. But what I think for me has been one of the things that's important to kind of understand has been that if we go back to that idea that approved young masculinities are built around, working class masculinities are built around a very narrow kind of way of being a man, then I think we can understand that in terms of thinking about some of the things that constitute being an approved young man are a product of privilege and wealth and status in the first place. So if you haven't got those, if you don't have those things to draw on in your configuration and performance as a man, if you can't, then you're left with what is it that I can draw on that is inherently mine as a man. And I think that's why we start to see for young men who don't have those access to those other forms of masculinities, a much stronger focus on those which they do have access to, and they do have access to sexuality and sex. They do, if they choose to, I guess, have access to performing a heterosexual lifestyle and using that as a means of superiority over women and what within it should be described as lesser men. And they do have opportunities for some kinds of sort of physical dominance. And I think for me, what we see is that actually what happens to working class masculinity is that they get disproportionately built around those factors. That's what young men are able to draw on. And added to that is that for the young men certainly who I've worked with over the years who are in those kind of very kind of deprived and excluded positions, they also are the young men who have the least opportunity for audiences that are going to reflect back something different to them. They're often the young men who aren't in school. They're often the young men who are estranged or have difficult relations with family. They're often in a position where actually they would reject as irrelevant to them all sorts of kind of social support and control. So not only have they got a more reduced repertoire, if you like, of ways of being a man open to them, they almost start to exist in an echo chamber where that way of being a man is constantly being reinforced and reproduced. And I think this is important from a policy point of view from the UK, because in policy, what we have tended to do is to penalise the young man, is to try and change the behaviour of the young man would be to criticise young men's sexual behaviour, to criticise young men's violence, their lack of engagement with school. When actually what we probably much more need to be doing is thinking about how we give all young men access to those different ways of doing masculinities. That may involve redistribution of wealth. It may involve different ways of distributing power and status in our societies. And that is a much more productive way of bringing about change in relation to young men. And I certainly think in the UK, we don't have that. I don't know if you do in Argentina. In the UK, we certainly don't. And I just wanted to say, some conscious of time, just something very quickly about the ideal sexual man, because I'm interested I've been interested in sex and masculinities. I think the idealized sexual man in UK terms is heterosexual, and Richardson, for example, has used the words that masculinities in the UK compels heterosexuality. That's their phrase. But it also has other components to it. That if talking to young men about how they construct their idea of what they and their peers would see as the appropriate way of doing heterosexuality, of performing heterosexuality, has been about voraciousness, about taking sexual opportunities. It's about laying claims to leadership and expertise and the superior role in terms of sex. It's very much focused on having a functional and attractive body, having the right body to do sex with, and also what's been described as the pornification of sexuality. So the kind of reproduction of particular ways of doing sex that are inherently exploitative to heterosex, in ways inherently exploitative to women. And these are the ideals, I think, in which men are trying to make sense of their sexuality. And in the UK, one of the difficulties I think we've had for many years is we don't have the levels of sex education, we don't have the levels of guidance and support for young men that allows them to think about how they challenge that way of being a man. And I think we're very poor so far at thinking through how we might challenge some of that construction of being a man. And I think there's some, and I think particularly I have an interest in understanding intimate partner violence and sexual violence, and I think there's some of the ways in which men deal with sex when they can't live up to that masculine ideal actually start to reproduce some of those problems. So when young men are seen to fail at sex, one of the common strategies that when we researched young men about what they did when sex didn't go well, the first thing they did was actually they said it was fine. So they would retell the story to their colleagues and friends completely differently. The other thing that was slightly concerning was that that very quickly became a way of blaming young women, that young women weren't performing their part of the sexual ideal rightly. So either they weren't being attractive enough, they weren't doing the sexual activities which the men wanted, and consequently those relationships didn't work. And I think there's been a shift there's been a kind of constant theme in research around young men's sexual health, which is just demonstrating how it's women that get the blame when sex doesn't work for men, and that's being reinforced, I think, for young people. I like that slide so much to put it there twice. And finally, I just want to say something about what I think is a new, and in the UK, I think a worrying discourse in masculinities, and I'm not. It's certainly around in America. I'm not sure how much is around in Latin America, but this idea that masculinities have fundamentally started to shift, and this has been I think, led by some American and UK academics, Eric Anderson and Mark McCormack. And their position is that actually there is a new way of doing masculinities, which consequently means that homophobia is something we no longer need to be concerned about, that we have dealt with homophobia. And the evidence they draw on is that there are men, and actually when you look at their research, there are middle-class men. There are men who are good at sport. There are men who are able to subvert usual ways of doing masculinities, but in a way that doesn't actually change anything. Right? And this has been used in the UK to suggest that we've had this fundamental shift in masculinities, and that we are starting to see a change such that we no longer need to be overly concerned about homophobia and about exploitation of women. And for me, it comes back to this notion about how we're able to practice as men. If we can draw on, if as a man you can draw on a whole range of other masculinity affirming characteristics, like you're good at sports, you're rich, you're privileged, then the fact that you put your arm around another man or you kiss another man, you are able to present that as a way that in a way that it can be presented as a way that actually means that there's a change in attitudes towards homophobia and affection between men. But in reality, it's just playing out a kind of subverted view of masculinities, and there is no change in how those underlying ideals of masculinity work. And I'm drawn, and I think one of the things that the two authors make a big claim about is the fact that in the UK and America, men greeting each other by kissing on the lips was becoming more and more popular. But this has always been something that men are able to do. And the other picture, I don't know how many of you are followers of football, but that's Alan Birchinall and Tony Curry in about 1970. I have a terrible knowledge. In about 1973. And they were very famously in the middle of a football match. They'd had a tackle, and they were kissing each other. And at the time, it caused concern in the news. But for me, it's exactly the same thing as we were seeing being replayed in some of these ideas of new masculinities. And actually, those two men, Tony Curry, was certainly implicated in violence against women. And Alan Birchinall remains a very kind of, traditional hegemonic masculine figure around football clubs in the UK. This was nothing to do with changes in attitudes then, and I think what we're seeing in terms of what's been described as new masculinities is nothing to do with change now. But it's a very worrying discourse that started to filter into how we think about masculinities, and is taking the focus away from the need for us to change. So thank you for listening and to my English, and I'm happy to answer any questions, of course.
Bueno, vamos a abrir unos minutos para preguntas o comentarios o reflexiones, lo que surja. Agradecerle muchísimo a Mar por la presentación. Quería agradecerle también, digamos, el compartir la foto, porque de alguna manera creo que marca el tono de la presentación de Mar, invitándonos a involucrarnos, ¿no? A dejarnos afectar por la temática. Me parece que es como un inicio bien interesante de nosotros como adultos pensando en los jóvenes, en estos hombres, varones que están construyéndose y poder afectarnos y pensarnos nosotros, ¿no? En este caso Mar como un adolescente y poder cambiar esa mirada y de alguna manera recuperar esas sensaciones. Y también quería recuperar, porque la verdad que en una presentación muy pequeña queda muy claro y me parece que es un debate muy interesante pensar el tema de las masculinidades no solamente en lo que hace a los sujetos, sino cómo esas masculinidades representan también una construcción y una distribución desigual e inequitativa, y que la manera de transformar no es convencer a los chicos que tienen que ser más buenos o de construirse, sino de alguna manera también transformar algo de las relaciones sociales que producen este tipo de subjetividad, ¿no? Así que bueno, quería recuperar esas dos cosas, agradecer a Mar y abrir a preguntas.
¿La hago en inglés directamente? O en castellano para todo el mundo. Oh. Bueno, no, la hago en castellano por el resto de la...
Pero yo creo que todo el mundo habla inglés, ¿no?
No, I think it's very interesting what you said about that redistribution of power and status is what we have to be thinking, no, about. I was wondering, have you given any steps in that direction, or do you have any ideas that you can share with us?
Yeah, well, yes, I think there's in a sense I think there's a solution which would be or part of a solution which would be really helpful, but I don't have any confidence it'll happen. Which I think we in the UK we have possibly the most unequal society in the world, and actually part of this is about redistribution of wealth. We have a huge amount of wealth that I don't, and I think there's fundamentally in some of this it is about how we distribute our resources so that people do have access to other forms of masculinities. I think other than that, at a more, and I think that's at a fundamental level, we can't kind of run away from that. But at a more immediate level, I think we're particularly in this project and others, we're interested in how the impact that schools can have, and I think there's and particularly interested in how we can use things like sex education. But it's been really good to hear about the kind of integrated and comprehensive sex education you have here. I think they're good opportunities, but more importantly, I think it's probably about how we enable working class young men to actually engage with school in the first place. That actually we have in the UK a relatively small number of young people who don't attend school at all when they should do, but we have quite a high number who describe that even when they're in school they feel marginalized and ignored, and there's lots of groups who would have that experience, but I think young men would as well. So I think for me there's some really structural things we could do, but I think that the more immediate things we could do were probably more related to how we engage young men in education and actually what we do with them once they're at the schools. But if anyone has any better solutions, I'd love to hear them.
No, bueno, mi pregunta va precisamente a secundaria, a la escuela secundaria, si bien acabas de señalar algo diferente, pero me gustó mucho esto de that you said that any performance has its audience, no? Mm-hmm. But what happened when this audience wants to have or to see a performance that it's in the way of this hegemonic masculinity, or what can we do from what can secondary school, the teachers, the professors, the other students do when this is happening? No? Yes. That's an important clue for me, because especially the education system has this hegemonic way of reaching sex. So they are responding to what the institution wants to see. Absolutely, many times. Yeah. No? Like as Willie says, no, said so long time ago.
Yeah, I completely agree. When one of the research projects I did with young men, we asked them who they trusted to talk to about sex and being a man, and the commonest response was my friends. And for quite a lot of young men, they were not able to name anyone else. And so you're right. You create that kind of what in English we would call an echo chamber. So I say to you, you say the same thing back to me, and gradually and I think you're right. I think there's something we need to be doing within schools, and things like how men behave in schools, male teachers behave in schools. As a very quick anecdote, I used to teach sex education in school, and was teaching in a classroom, a group of boys and we were talking about respect and treating each other respectfully, and outside the classroom, sort of equivalent about that, outside the door, there was a teacher in the school who was shouting and pointing at a child, and you think, what's the point in me being here? We've had a 30-minute lesson, which you may or may not have listened to, and you walk out into an environment that just reinforces ways of being masculine. So I agree. I think that it's much less about the talk curriculum and much more about how we model masculinities in schools.
Okay, there are some intergalactic questions coming from people who are connected virtually, and then we'll come back to the Earth.
Sí, vamos a leer la pregunta y después te pasamos. Luis Carlos Ariel Ruiz Chow asks, you have a very interesting reflection. In Nicaragua, there are discourses about the LGBTQ community, but they talk about the communities in a general way, when in reality it's not the same to be a young LGTB from the working class, from the middle class or upper class, and if you can comment on how this exclusion for poverty apply also to the community.
Possibly, but I've probably got a colleague who can do it a lot better.
Okay, well,
I think so. While we've been in Argentina, it's been thank you for the warm welcome and the interest that you've shown in issues around LGBT young people. And we have visited people some who are in the audience, and we have met with ministers, and we have seen all the work that's being done. And there are some strong similarities between the way that LGBT young people's life experiences is mediated or shaped by the socioeconomic resources that they have. So the patterning in the UK would be similar, that if you are from a poor background and you are LGBT, that means it's harder to deal with the discrimination and the violence maybe that you may come across. So that might mean that you are more likely to be made homeless, so thrown out of home. It may mean that you have less education to be able to find the information and the resources in order to find yourself a place to live. There is some suggestion in the evidence that LGBT young people from poorer backgrounds are more likely to leave school early, have less qualifications, are less likely to have a good job and a happier life. So that there is a very, very distinct difference between being LGBT and being wealthy and privileged in comparison to being poor and having fewer resources.
Yo, bien, perdón. ¿Qué tal? Buenos días. Lucía me llamo. La pregunta es, ¿cuál sería la importancia, cuál es la importancia de las masculinidades femeninas en la constitución de otras posibilidades de modelos identificatorios para generar nuevas masculinidades posibles, y cuál es el vínculo de esta temática de las masculinidades femeninas o de otro tipo de masculinidades que estén alojadas en otros cuerpos con el rol de los docentes y las docentes en una escuela, por ejemplo, secundaria. ¿Cómo se podría generar nuevos modelos identificatorios en otros cuerpos que no sean de varones cis para generar nuevos posibles identificatorios, digamos?
So you were asking about. So you're asking about how gender is dealt with, treated in schools? Yeah.
Well, she's asking about how, because she's talking about cis men, and she said, well, but what about the males who are not cis? How does play a role in this?
Okay. So what's happened in the UK is the gender, the debates about gender, trans, cis, has become exploded. Okay, you are experiencing that here, I think. Yeah, the young people. I'm not this. I'm non-binary. I'm this. Don't try and label me. You know, that is there, but it's almost separate. Okay, there's a distance between that proliferation and the dominant, the dominant cisgender masculinity. So there's lots of activity and change and institutions trying to understand, but it's almost separate. So left masculinity, dominant heterosexuality, cis is left over here, not challenged so much. Potentially, what's happening here in gender diversity should impact on and loosen, the grip of mainstream dominant masculinity. But I think we're waiting for that moment. Yes. So you are experiencing the, and it's the same in the UK, the gender ideology, don't touch my kids. So a reaction against the challenges to cis masculinity, and it's similarly in the UK, some very high-powered, well-resourced anti-trans, we call it anti-trans movement, with the same. Gender is fixed. There's man, there's woman. Don't touch it. So there's it's complex. Does that answer?
Thank you.
Buenas, ¿qué tal? Mi nombre es Nicolás y una pregunta particularmente con respecto al tema del deporte y cómo se toman las masculinidades no hegemónicas en el deporte, si creen que hay como una coartación de cualquier tipo de identidad no hegemónica masculina, y si eso impide un desarrollo deportivo particularmente sostenido desde la institución educativa en las clases de educación física. Particularmente con las identidades masculinas, pero que son no hegemónicas. Acá en Argentina podemos hablar de identidades maricas, de nenes maricas en la escuela, y cómo también eso se coarta la expresión de la educación física, y si eso se sostiene también desde la escuela.
Thank you. For me, I think the way sport is structured in the UK, it supports and reinforces particular types of masculinities. So young men who are good at sports, who meet the kind of masculine ideals of body, describe not only the sport itself as affirming, but also everything that goes around sport, particularly in school settings. So in schools, what men will often find a really difficult point of conflict, uncertainty, are things like shared changing spaces. So that's when they have the opportunity to compare bodies that so whether your body is developed, in the right way, become very much kind of visible within sport. And then in the performance of sport itself, reinforces those ideas of what constitutes being masculine. And in the UK, we still celebrate sport in a different way to we celebrate almost anything else. That it is a hugely important part of the status of a school or an institution. So the institution itself starts to reinforce ways of doing masculinities that are about sport. And I think that means if you're not either you're not interested or you don't have the bodily abilities around sport, then actually you become further marginalized. And this is why I think this my concern about this kind of notion of a new masculinities is that you have a group of men whose masculinity is so unassailable, it's so clear, that those young men can start to play around with how men can work with each other. That doesn't make any difference to the experience of other young men in schools who are the victims of homophobia or anything else. And so for me, sports just reinforces that divide between the masculine and non-masculine.
We have another question from the virtual audience. It's long. It's from Carlos Cáceres, and he said, "Thank you for your presentation. I think the focus on masculinity is very important, but perhaps some key element of a comprehensive conceptual model has not been fully identified. A key point of entry to this area of inquiry has been gender-based violence, and it has reinforced the idea that men are essentially problematic and that all derives from patriarchy. However, in the working classes, the actual power of men was always relativized by issues of class, and the use of violence was never considered fully legitimate. Violent behavior of working class men was in fact considered the expression of brutality and lack of education and never approved of. So it can be argued that patriarchy never expressed legitimate power to men in the working class. Currently, we seem to keep talking about powerful men who are the focus of strong criticism, and it, from a working class background, are less powerful than ever before, and might consequently feel more marginalized than in the past. Any thoughts about this?
Yeah. I'm thinking it's a very good quick typer. I think yes. But I think if I didn't make it, I think I did try and touch it. I think there are differences around working class masculinities, and I think and my sense from a UK perspective, as I think I said, that working class masculinities seem to be overly reliant on demonstrating superiority over women, and that becoming part of or become implicated in violence against women. I think it's really important in when we think about masculinities is that for me the important relationships we have to understand in masculinities is relationships between men. There's and that actually the hierarchies that exist within men, which are a product of social status, of wealth, of all those things, are what operate on men. So men are more worried usually when you talk to them about what other men think of them. So I think that creates the opportunity. I think there's always the opportunity that in most societies the social position of men is dominant over women, and I see some changes, but and therefore the men have the opportunity for violence against women always exists. But I think but whether the degree to which that's necessary to perform your masculinity, I think varies in terms of social status. So I think it is really important that we understand the differences between men in terms of social class, but that shouldn't should be seen alongside recognizing the social inequalities between men or masculinities and women and femininities in society. I think it's really important we keep the two, look at the two together.
Thank you. Gracias, Mark. Bueno, le vamos a pasar el mic ahora a Elizabeth McDemon, Liz, después de esta semana. Liz es también investigadora de Lancaster, de la Universidad de Lancaster, con muchos años, creo que más de 20 años de investigación en temáticas que tienen que ver con los jóvenes LGTB, en relación con la salud mental y la exclusión, y es también consultora de organismos gubernamentales y también internacionales en temáticas de jóvenes LGTB. Y bueno, le paso la palabra, así aprovechamos que creo que hay mucho interés en la audiencia en esta presentación también.
Thank you. I must apologize as well for my Spanish being so poor that I'm going to speak to you in English. And I'm going to talk to you about... Closer? Ah. I have a loud voice. Normally it's no issue. Yeah. Better? And I'm going to talk to you about a study that was conducting at national level, investigating LGBT young people, suicide and self-harm. And before I talk about the study, I wanted to say a little bit about what a fantastic experience we are having in Argentina. First of all, in Buenos Aires. First of all, amazing, warm people. We love the kissing, right? Yeah, we are going to go to the UK and do that in our workplace. And also just for me personally to see all the different ways in which you're dealing with sexual and gender diversity in the country is just fantastic. I've been working in this field of LGBT population health, both as a health worker, as a public health worker, and now as an academic for 30 years, yeah, and it's been sometimes a long, long battle, yeah. So it's wonderful to see you all taking up and addressing the issue. The other thing I wanted to say is that we love FLACSO. You are like our sister brother institution. You work in the same way that we do. We were taking marginalized issues around health, education, wanting to make change, government level, through social policy, but always working with the individuals affected by marginalization and organizations that are working with those populations. So that is how we also work and how we think research should be done. So through participation and trying to impact. So this study that I'm going to talk about does all that. Voila. And it is a study that was, in a similar way to Argentina, a study that was commissioned by the government, the health department, to provide evidence to support the implementation of the National Suicide Prevention Strategy. So at a national level, there was a recognition that LGBTQ populations and indeed LGBT youth populations were more vulnerable to suicide and self-harm. So this study, rather than demonstrating the inequality between LGBT youth and heterosexual cis youth, was trying to understand why. Okay, why do LGBT young people have a higher likelihood of feeling suicide and self-harming? Also, it was trying to understand when young LGBT people feel distressed, feel like hopelessness, what do they do? In what ways do they seek help? And by providing evidence around both those things, why is there a problem? What are the causes? And also, what do young people actually do? Then we're more likely to get evidence that allows us to create the solution to the problem. So I'm going to talk about three things briefly. This is very briefly. I'm going to talk about what we found in the study in terms of why there seems to be a greater incidence of suicidality and self-harm in LGBT young people. Briefly about what help seeking, so what did they do to try and help? And then very briefly, what in the UK we consider the major policy levers, so the main focus for policy in order to address the problem. Briefly, it was a UK-wide study, a national study. It was a mixed methodology, and within that, we really prioritized the participation and the perspectives of LGBT young people. So the name, Queer Futures, was designed by young people. We had a competition. They all, wrote in, and in the end, we voted on the name. So right from the beginning, young people were involved. We had two ways of involving those young LGBT young people. We did an online Facebook group, and also we went to, in the UK, we have LGBT youth groups, so like NGOs throughout the country, not everywhere, and we involved those youth groups in the research we were doing, designing the questions, advice on how to do that ethically, advice on how to recruit young people, and also the issues generally. So we did online and face-to-face qualitative interviews, and the second stage. So from those interviews, we then designed a online questionnaire. We also did a questionnaire with mental health staff. So those are the staff that work within the mental health service in the UK, but I'm not going to talk about that today. Okay, so findings. So how do we explain that there's a higher rate of suicidality and self-harm in LGBT young people? And we found that there were 5 major factors that influenced the higher incidence. The first was the experiences of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. The experience of sexual and gender norms. And what I mean by that is being made to feel that you are not normal, but there's no violence involved, no abuse, not direct, so the implicit, kind of hidden, Third one was the difficulties in managing your sexual and gender diversity in different parts of your life, home, online, school, and we came across that, didn't we, when we talked to the young people in Argentina. The stress of, does my dad know? Does my mum know? Who's online? What if I post this here? Will someone see this? It was stressful and a contributing factor. The fourth one was that the young people that participated in the study felt they were unable to talk about the emotions they had around their mental health and their sexual and gender diversity. And the fifth aspect was all the other life stuff that happens, school, divorce, family breakup, kind of contributing. So not only is it about sexual and gender diversity or sexual and gender identity, it's also other life stuff, money, etc. So I'm just going to say a little bit more about that. It's doing 2 clicks. So first of all, homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. And we wanted to know where that was happening. So you can see on this graph that the place where where young people most experience hostility around their sexual and gender identity difference was at school. So over 80%, which is not a surprise, okay? And then you can see the lesser places are in public spaces, on the internet, and at home. So we need to remember that when we think about policy that we want to drive forward or how we're going to tackle the issue. So when we looked at we did the statistical analysis, we found that 70% of the sample had, have I not clicked? It's because I'm clicking now. Too many clicking. 70% had experienced abuse when they were self-harming, or so abuse around their sexuality or gender, or feeling suicidal. Those who were trans or gender diverse or unsure about their gender, and those who were disabled were twice as likely to experience abuse around their sexuality and gender in comparison to lesbian and gay and non-disabled. Bisexual participants were less likely to experience biphobia. And if you had experience of that abuse, you were 1.5 times more likely to have planned or attempted suicide. So the more extreme end of mental health, poor mental health. So that was, thank you. Can you keep saying? So that was the first factor, very, very strongly related to homophobia and biphobia and transphobia, very strongly related to the likelihood of feeling suicidal. The second factor was the experience of sexual and gender norms. So not violence or active discrimination, but silencing of the different sexualities, ignoring it, making slight negative comments, and that we wanted to try and understand that a bit more in the survey, and also in the interview. Thank you. Yeah, the whole audience just go click. So this is an example of one of the young people that we interviewed. This is Farouk, who was 24, gay, cis male, and British Asian, and talks about how he had difficulty accepting his sexuality, felt lonely and isolated, and would go home and self-harm because of the distress. And he put that down to a lot of because his community and friends who were Asian thought being gay was completely wrong. So they didn't actively abuse him or beat him up, but he knew within his friends and community that it was wrong to be gay. So this is what I mean by sexual norms, just they're implicit there. And we found that that trans young people, gender diverse, help me. Gender diverse young people were more likely to feel the strength of those norms, and they were more likely then to plan or attempt suicide. And bisexual young people were least likely to feel the strength of those norms, and least likely also to feel that affected their suicidal feelings. Yes. The third factor was this idea of trying to manage your sexual and gender identity across different parts of your life. And this is a bit of a complicated graph, but we wanted to ask where the places and how often the young people were hiding their sexuality or their gender identity. So, for example, in religious places, all of the time, the majority of young people were hiding. In school, majority of the time, most of the time, you can see quite often, not so many were out. Similarly at home, the internet, people find places to be out, right? It's very, very, very important, yeah, to young people. And what we found was that most young people found the stress of telling people in one space, hiding it in others, very distressing, and the trans young people found this most distressing, and they were more likely to be distressed by this process compared to lesbian, gay, bisexual young people. And this distress around hiding your sexuality and gender identity increased the likelihood that you would self-harm and also plan or attempt suicide. And this was a surprise to us that the young people talked a lot, particularly in the interviews, about how they didn't have anyone to talk to. And that was talking about their emotions and their distress, about all things really, about their sexuality and gender, but also about feeling distressed, and that contributed to their poor mental health and their suicidality. I'm speeding up now. And you can see on this graph that most of the young people that completed the survey felt that being unable to talk about their emotions was a contributing factor to their self-harm and suicidality. And the last contributing factor to trying to explain why is all the other life stuff that affects all young people. And again, this is a bit of a complicated graph that I'm not going to go through, but these are all factors that the young people, you can see, said completely, so the blue here, completely, very much, these start, and this was the most effect, saying that these were contributing factors. So bullying around other issues than sexuality, gender, death of a friend, academic pressure in the UK, ending with their own relationships, financial problems, family breakdown, all the things that stress us all, right? You know. So we did some complicated statistical analysis to look at, if we put all those factors together, what was the most important factor in explaining the extreme end? So what would explaining why a young LGBT person might attempt to take their own life? So we found that self-harming, and this is replicated throughout mental health literature, were over nearly 7.5 times more likely to have attempted suicide in comparison to those who hadn't self-harmed. Those who were affected felt that not being able to talk affected their mental health, were nearly 2.5 times more likely to have attempted suicide. Those who were disabled, twice as likely to attempt suicide. Those who felt that they were affected by homophobic, transphobic, biphobic abuse, twice as likely. And overall, those with gender diverse identities, so trans, gender queer, whatever, were 1.5 times more likely in comparison to cis LGB young people to have attempted suicide. So those were the big findings. We then wanted also to know, okay, what are young people doing to help themselves when they're feeling distressed? So we started off asking in the survey, who did they ask for help? And you can see here that nearly half of the sample, okay, talk to a friend. Nearly half the sample, the internet. So no one's talking to an adult here. There were quite a few, a third of the sample that went to less primary care, GP. Often that was facilitated, at least by parents. But significantly, a fifth of the sample didn't ask anyone for any help. And you can see these are all school counsellor, teachers, helplines, parents. You can see that there are actually very few are asking for help. So this is, in the UK, this is a big concern, which is worrying. And what we also found was that young people, if they did ask, LGBT people, if they did ask for help, were waiting till they were in crisis. So waiting till there was a point where they felt they were a threat to their own life. And this is Lee, who was a 17 trans male, pansexual, white, who said, I suppose the turning point, so they're talking about looking for help. I suppose the turning point for me was the realization I'd die if I didn't decide to get better. I didn't want to feel like this for the rest of my life. I wanted to achieve something. So this is also a concern to us, because obviously if you get young people to support and help early on, they don't get to a crisis point. So we wanted to know more about why they didn't ask for help, okay? Because that helps us work out the solutions. And over half the sample said they didn't ask for help because they didn't want to be seen as attention-seeking. I don't know, do you understand what I say by attention-seeking? Yeah, in the UK, yes. Didn't seek help because they didn't want anyone to worry about them. They felt ashamed. So mental health in the UK, I think probably over the world, is very stigmatized. So they felt ashamed about their self-harm and suicidal feelings. They were worried about their family being disappointed, so they didn't want to be judged. They thought they wouldn't be taken seriously by adults, and they didn't want anyone to know about their sexual or gender identity. So often these were multiple, okay, not just one answers. They could choose many. So lots of reasons there about being young, being related to how we treat in the UK as adults, young people, how we dismiss their feelings, and also young people's desire to not be a burden to people, not to be a burden to their family, not disappoint them. So and also fears of how their sexual and gender identity may be treated by adults. So quite complicated reasons why those young people in the study didn't ask for help. So therefore, the solution not simple. Yeah. So this we kind of characterized the reasons for why there is this reluctance to seek help when you feel distressed and upset, and you're around fears about the reactions to their LGBT identity, the stigma around mental health, feeling like adults wouldn't take them seriously, and for some young people, they felt they were coping and didn't need help, and they should be coping. So I'm just going to finish with one slide, which is about. So that was just a brief overview of what we did, about what then we think needs to change in terms of a policy level. And the big areas really are tackling homophobic, biphobic, transphobic abuse in schools, because you saw on the slides I've shown you that is a place where most often young people experience abuse. It's also a factor that's strongly associated with suicidality in LGBT young people. The second area of public policy that in the UK we're trying to push is the idea of challenging what is normal around sexuality and gender, and you are doing great work here. So inclusive criteria in schools, those sorts of things. The third area is about providing safe and non-judgmental environments for LGBT young people to talk about their emotions and their mental health. And I am leading a big study in the UK now, which is looking at how do we do that? Where is the best place? Should it be clinical? Should it be at home? Should it be online? Okay, so we're trying to work out with young people what is best. And I suppose to say that the UK doesn't know what it's doing. The government doesn't know what it's doing. I keep telling the government, you don't know what you're doing. So we have this evidence that's emerging, that's trying to find the solutions. But like in every country, sometimes the government are, it's a problem. So it's a battle. But these are the policy areas that we're trying to kind of push and develop. And we have a website, the Queer Futures website, where you can download free reports and slides and stuff if it's useful to you. And there's a second website, which is called Queer Futures 2, so same, but with a 2. And that has other stuff on it, which is about the study, which is investigating how do we support LGBT young people's mental health. Yes, that's enough. Thank you.
Gracias, Liz, por la excelente exposición y una reflexión personal de esta semana de trabajo con los colegas y también de la exposición de Liz en particular, y consecuencia también del trabajo que hizo Blas Radi en relevar la bibliografía local, es que poco sabemos de las experiencias de los jóvenes LGTB y qué necesidad y en ese sentido qué estimulante es esta iniciativa que toma FLACSO con tanto entusiasmo en términos de poder empezar a relevar esa evidencia, ¿no? Pero sabemos muy poco de la experiencia, de cómo viven y transitan los jóvenes LGTB su adolescencia, el paso por la escuela. Sabemos que tenemos marcos normativos, sabemos que esos marcos normativos no están implementados completamente, pero conocemos muy poco sobre la experiencia, así que creo que la presentación de Liz es una inspiración y mucho entusiasmo para esta iniciativa de colaboración con Lancaster. Y bueno, dicho esto, a modo de reflexión personal, abrimos para preguntas. Florencia.
Bueno, me pareció... ¿en inglés? Okay, I found very interesting your presentation, and I was wondering the stress you put in mental health and fear of going to mental health. I imagine you know in Argentina we have a quite big psi community, and here mental health is approached, I think, in a different way than in many countries. So I was wondering, I do not know what happens here if this variable is as relevant as it is in the UK, and if there, I don't know if you or maybe people in the audience know if there are studies showing, or because I think that I imagine that it might be different in Argentina because mental health is seen less stigmatizing. We think that in all stages of our lives we can consult a psychiatrist, a psychoanalyst, and so I was wondering that, and it is a question to you, but also maybe to the audience. Thank you. It was very interesting.
Yes. So from my understanding, internationally, there are big differences between how we think about mental health that are often related to ethnicity, religion, particular cultural contexts, and what I think the stigmatizing aspect is a very Eurocentric English. It is tied into our colonialist, capitalist, neoliberal notion of what a human should be. We should be rational, functioning, successful, and to worry, to be distressed, to feel bad. You know, you are then a failure. You are not a successful individual, and that's at root, I think, of the very white Western hostility to mental health. I think studies-wise, mental health research is under-researched in comparison to physical health, and I think because it's, you know, the money is in English-speaking countries, that what happens is, like masculinity, that our understanding of mental health as a disease, as a pathology, as something wrong with you, is very defined by psychiatry and psychology and very narrow. And so that gets replicated throughout the world, and actually different ways of thinking about mental health that you're describing get lost, you know, are not as prominent.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. I have two questions, sorry. One more methodological, and I like to know how did you work, or how did you create the categories when you ask them? The categories, the categories, yes. And the other one is there are a few that said that they talk with adults, yes, but what characteristics has that adults? What are they? Why they talk with them? Because maybe that's a way to find or a way to think other ways of working with yes. young people yes. At schools or in every institutions.
Yes.
No, just something to complement his question is a methodological issue based on how did you create the list of life crises? I mean, so
okay, yes.
Another methodological. This is the methodological time. Yeah.
Is just to clarify, is previous experience of abuse meaning of sexual abuse, or is sexual abuse included?
When I'm, yes, yeah. So you're talking about here, or so this here. This is any type of abuse apart from related to sexual and gender identity. So being a it includes, yeah, it's included, yeah. So staying with method, so we used a mixed methodology. Oh, I'm sorry. Click on my click. I'm in the moment. I'm talking. We used a mixed methodology, and the rationale for that is because this is a topic and a population group that is understudied. We wanted to start from the ground up. Okay, so if we had created our categories, our questions, we may have missed very important factors. So that meant we started with a qualitative component, okay, which was exploratory, to find out what are the issues, okay. Then we did an analysis of them in relation to the research questions, and from then we created the online survey. So some of the questions are from the first component. Some of the questions are standard questions that have been used in mental health research, so particularly around suicidality questions, self-harm questions. So that meant the results we produced were then comparable to other research in the UK. Some questions we refused to use the standard questions because the young people. So question about, so in the UK we have a standard question for sexual orientation and gender identity. But for example, in the sexual orientation question, the standard question, the responses are lesbian, gay, bisexual, heterosexual. And the young people were like, we need many, many more. Yeah. And similarly with gender identity, they wanted other categories so that we would capture all the different identifications. Life crisis, those categories came from the same process. What the young people said, the qualitative process, and also major factors that we know are important to suicidality, sexual abuse, for example. Does that answer the question? Second question. We did ask about, not in the survey, because when you do a survey, right, you have to keep it small, 15 minutes, yeah. But in the interviews, the young people talked about the adults that they did talk to, trustworthy, they were show characteristics of trustworthy, non-judgmental. There was something about that adult that meant they knew they were friendly and welcoming to be LGBT. That may be that the person was LGBT, and most often that was the case. So a member of the family, gay uncle, yeah, or a teacher, or someone in their life that they knew, or that the adult showed that they were friendly, rainbow, or they were in a situation where. But most often, who they talked to was had some LGBT component. That was the key. Yeah.
We have another question from the audience. We're gonna read this, and then we're gonna take two more from here because it's a matter of time. So there was hands. Carlos Cáceres, also from the virtual audience. Thank you for this nice presentation. Our regional online LAME survey found a similar situation. I think, however, that this focus of research has often left aside the role of the LGBTQ community themselves, or LGBTQ community cultural for that sake. For example, does the community offer a nurturing space for young people where they are socialized into life as LGBT individuals? Some might argue that in many places, gay culture is individualistic, competitive in terms of looks and sexual performance, and many gay people might get depressed because they don't fit the standards and are rejected by people they approach. Would it be possible to study not only this issue, but also potential new positive roles of communities in this regard?
What a lovely question. Yes. So in this study, so remember, it's funded by the government, evidence for to support the prevention of suicide strategy. What we found, and this I had slides on this, but I took them out, is we asked the young people what would their preferred, where would they most like to get help from? And number one, LGBT community. Okay, someone that delivered, not clinical, not teachers, not clinic. Okay, LGBT community. So I am now doing the study that I'm talking about. The government has funded me to look at where are the best places, because of this research, where are the best, we know that those LGBT people, young people, are not asking for help. We know that they would prefer to use LGBT-friendly spaces, community. So this study I'm doing now that they're funding me is to look at what type of support, where should it be, and we're not very far into it, but some of those places will be in the LGBT community, youth groups, and other such things. Some school settings, and hardly any clinical. Yeah, but so yes, to answer the question, it is very, very important because the LGBT community, in many cases, what they're doing is not clinical work. What they're doing is providing spaces for young people to be together, to work out what they want to be in a supportive environment, and learn how to be a person they want to be without being sexualized, without being depressed, in a positive environment.
Hola, bueno, ¿qué tal? Primero quería preguntar en las categorías de crisis, ¿por qué, si es que se te pasó la cuestión de, hablo en español porque no soy bilingüe, porque no tengo el capital cultural, la cuestión del consumo problemático de drogas, como un agravante en la salud mental, lo que se llama acá en Argentina como trastorno dual. También quería comentar que bueno, que el año pasado trabajo por un área de gobierno y estuvimos trabajando en salud mental y nos tocó relevar la situación de un hospital en particular de salud mental. Estamos en una coyuntura donde recién, hace poco, la noticia creo que fue del día de ayer, se pensó, o en realidad se incluye en el censo 2020 recién, las familias LGBTQ y sobre todo las identidades trans. Digo, hasta que no tengamos estadísticas y números trans, difícilmente tengamos investigaciones sobre salud trans. También en una coyuntura donde tenemos el DSM-5 que cambió la categoría de disforia de género por incongruencia de género, lo cual a mí me parece lo mismo, y creo que sigue patologizando nuestras identidades. Entonces creo que en realidad estamos frente a un nuevo cambio de paradigma, y que debemos no solamente como entender a la comunidad trans como sujeto de análisis, sino también construir y generar nuevas epistemologías desde las identidades trans, ¿no? Cómo nos incluimos nosotras, sobre todo la comunidad trans femenina, dentro de los espacios educativos, que son espacios que nos rechazan constantemente, que no nos abrazan, y sobre todo cuando se hace mucho más complejo llegar a estudios universitarios, ¿no? Yo estoy estudiando antropología en la Universidad de San Martín, y la verdad que no es una tarea sencilla, y que bueno, ¿qué pasa, digamos, con la academia? Cómo la academia abre las puertas para que nosotras entremos, porque sabemos que, bueno, hoy en día no existe esta paridad de género que se espera entre mujeres y hombres cis. Para nosotras, pensándonos como investigadoras en el día de mañana, ¿dónde quedamos nosotras paradas? digo, en esa repartición, digamos, de poderes dentro de la academia y dentro de los saberes académicos.
Gracias. Y la última pregunta, Blas.
Can I answer that now? It's a very important question. Are you going to translate?
¿Necesitas traducción?
Here, yeah, listen.
Okay.
This is the pathologization of trans and the question of power in the academies and epistemology. Very, very, very important. It's a fantastic question, and those questions all the time we are grappling with trying to, because you are right, to change the pathologization, to challenge the pathologization. One way is to open out academies so that trans people are researchers, they drive, yeah. But in the UK, it's very difficult to do. Yeah. So we could do that, yeah. One of the in the UK in Lancaster, what we do, I have 2 trans PhD students who are investigating how do we think about gender identity, trans identity without pathology, okay, which is very, very important. The other one is looking at how do we look at mental health issues for trans people without pathologizing, without saying you have poor mental health because of your gender identity, okay. So small ways of doing that. And in the UK there is some NGOs that do have a communication with the government. So the government does sometimes listens, but they so that is it's an activist, and it's an issue that is being trying to deal with it. It's very difficult because also in the UK is the power of medicine, the power of psychiatry, the power that defines everything. So all the time it's the trans community and those of us in academia, some trying to say we need to think about gender identity away from it as a medical condition. The DSM just you want to rip it up. So it's a problem, a massive problem, and we certainly aren't solving it, just in small ways trying to get to that position, to the challenging the epistemology of what we know about trans and gender identity is extremely important. So thank you for raising that.
I just want to add, I know we're running out of time, Raul is looking at me, but I just want to say something connecting, relating with the question of Florencia in terms of the access, and it's true that I think in Argentina maybe it's not as stigmatized in mental health, but the problem is that the training of the professionals, mental health professionals, is very conservative, very cis, and even if they ask, the problem when you access the services is that you're trans or you are non-binary, and that became the problem, and not a real problem. Maybe we don't have this stigmatization, but being a little bit from the world, I know that more of the colleagues, they still have this pathologizing approach. So that I think is very important what you bring also about producing new epistemologies. And ella también she also asked why you didn't incorporate drugs.
Because we didn't include drug abuse because it didn't come up as a problem identified in the first part of the research. So
well, I think that my question is really easy.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so.
A methodological question. Because I was thinking that to be openly LGBT, especially trans, implies so many risks. You know that, and also the study shows it. And the question is, how did you get to guarantee participation and confidentiality, especially considering that you were working with schools and the government?
Yeah. we didn't work with schools. So precisely because of the risks, we ran the study mainly online. So it was a digital methodology. So in that way, and many young people, as you could see from there, were not open about their sexuality or gender to at home or school or wherever. But online, I mean, there are all sorts of things you have to do to make that a confidential experience process. But that was the rationale for using digital methodologies, because it allowed that control and confidentiality, and it allows young people's control, so they can, switch off when they want, decide to say what they want. But it was really interesting because they told us things because you can't see. Yeah, they told us very private things that I don't think, particularly around suicide, which is very difficult to speak about. But when you're online, no one can see you. They told us a lot of detail in comparison. So we did do some face-to-face. It was much harder to get the young people to talk about what is a very distressing personal kind of experience. So that's why we didn't go to schools. No.
Ok, vamos a hacer un break acá, le regalamos un aplauso y a la gente que está conectada virtualmente les decimos que vamos a hacer un descanso de unos 10 minutos, no se vayan. Si quieren mandar un comentario, Salud Inglés. Y en ese ámbito ha trabajado sobre problemáticas prevalentes en la niñez y ha desarrollado un modelo de hospital amigable basado en los derechos que en su momento fue publicado y tomado por algunos países como modelo de intervención. Uno de ellos es Chile, en donde el Hospital Calvo Maquena, que es el equivalente al Garraham de Argentina, desde hace años viene trabajando con esta modalidad. Y este proceso se disparó a través de dos profesionales de ese hospital. Llamativamente, casualmente o no, el área de trabajo social y el área de salud mental. Y a partir de esto dispararon un proceso que ya lleva unos cuantos años trabajándolo y que han generado un cambio cultural que realmente es espectacular en ver cómo cada una de las personas ha tomado la temática de derechos como un eje que atraviesa sus prácticas en el ámbito de los servicios. Y ahora, hoy a la tarde se va a Chile y quieren ir avanzando y profundizando este proceso en cuanto a los aspectos de planificación y gestión hospitalaria y contratación del personal. O sea que todo esto va a atravesar todos los rincones y espacios sabidos y por haber en el ámbito hospitalario. Habría mucha experiencia para compartir, pero simplemente para saber uno de sus campos de interés y campos de trabajo. Y lo mismo lo está desarrollando en Nepal. Y posteriormente Alex, que es investigadora de la Universidad de Lancaster, va a tomar la temática de fundamentalmente de aspectos de participación en investigación. Sus intereses son acorde a lo que habíamos escuchado de las disertaciones anteriores en cuanto a que la temática de desigualdades y inequidades en salud y particularmente aquellas vinculadas con la discapacidad. Pero hoy por hoy es parte integrante del equipo y tiene un rol particular en cuanto a lo que es el acompañamiento del grupo de jóvenes LGBT que se constituyó para este proyecto, en donde hemos generado dos equipos de trabajo, uno en Inglaterra, coordinado por Alex, y uno en Argentina, que está coordinado por Carlota y por Karina. Y esto fue una experiencia interesante en donde ayer pudieron dialogar jóvenes de distintos países que pese a las diferencias son mucho más las similitudes y las cuestiones que los vinculan y las vinculan. Hechas estas consideraciones, me avisan acá, viste, si no seguía hablando. Tenía preparada una canción también, bueno, pero Andrew, it's your turn. Yeah.
Right, okay. Is that close enough? That's close enough. Okay. Well, thank you, Raoul, and really just to echo what Mark and Liz have already said, it's been we've had a really productive, really enjoyable week here in Buenos Aires and at FLACSO so far, and it's just been a real privilege and a pleasure just to be working together on this. I hope you'll forgive me, but I made a little bit of a late change in the presentation that I was going to share with you. I think originally I was going to talk a little bit as a follow-on to Alex's academic elements of participation by talking about some of the practicalities and barriers and challenges around more generic aspects of young people's participation. But I think sort of following kind of some of the dialogue and discussion and interest in the first part of this morning, I've perhaps decided to talk about some other aspects of working with young people and LGBTQ young people within schools and what we know about that, and just to share with you some experience and data that was collected from the north of England recently. So I hope you'll forgive that slight change, and I hope that will be interesting and contribute to your conversation. I think as Raoul said in his previous introduction, I don't work for a university. I'm a public health specialist and nurse by background. I've spent most of the last 20-25 years working in different services and NGOs, both in the UK and in many other countries. Usually lower middle income countries, but some high income countries also. I'm mainly operational. I'm involved in designing programs and supporting more technical aspects of those, particularly for maternal, child and adolescent health, service related and public health elements. But I've always been a firm believer that in order to do that well, you have to know your population. And so that means understanding and trying to get a more accurate picture of what that really means. So over the years, that's brought me in closer contact with colleagues in universities, such as colleagues here in Lancaster, and with Raoul and your colleagues at FLACSO as well. So I move a bit between operational services and university research. So what I'd like to discuss and share with you a little bit is around some findings and a process that we've been implementing and using in the northwest of England for several years now, since 2011. And the reason I thought it was worth sharing with you was that this looks at a slightly younger age group than Ms. talked about in her research. And also it steps a little bit away from more formal research into information and data that can try and be collected annually by more routine approaches within services, because sometimes that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get ongoing systems of understanding, both to track change and also to make decisions on an ongoing basis. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of where we did this, something about the methods and analysis, a little bit about the findings and the limitations, and also where we think some of its strengths and contribution lies as well. So just a little bit of geographical context for you. Where you can see is an area in the northwest of England called Lancashire. It's quite a large county. It's one of the largest counties in the UK. It has a very diverse population. It has some of the poorest areas of the UK, in fact some of the poorest areas of Northern Europe, but it also has some of the wealthiest as well. It has urban population, and it also has a rural population, and it has quite an ethnically diverse population as well, in terms of quite a large South Asian population. It's not ethnically diverse in terms of Black Afro-Caribbean population, but it is in most other forms. Population around young people is widely dispersed, and the majority go to government schools. Healthcare is primarily serviced by government health providers, and the organisation I was working for at that time was the Government Health Service, providing primary care and mental health services across the whole area. Ironically, actually Lancaster is not included in this catchment area because it sits just to the south of that, but the rest of the most of the rest of the population is. So at this time, I was working as a public health development lead for children and families, which meant I worked across a range of services, including schools, and we had particular interest in trying to understand well-being and health needs of young people better. In a sense, the background was that in around 2011, we tried to take a step back and look at services we had for school-aged children. Everybody was working hard. Services are configured a little bit differently to here in Argentina. There is a school nursing service, there are other primary care services, and they link by referral to other parts of the health system. But what we found when we were being objective was that actually we had a very inequitable service for children. Really good things might be happening here, but not over here. Your experience for support and advice as a young person was a lottery, really. Safeguarding, so child protection issues, really dominated the majority of what a lot of public health and staff, health staff for school were involved with. We had very limited ways of measuring and understanding whether all that effort we were putting in was actually changing outcomes and helping children and young people as well. And that's common in a lot of health services. We count a lot about what we do, not the change that it creates. And that's a challenge facing health services in all countries, really. At that time, we were also, the landscape of how health services were paid for and commissioned was changing in the UK as well. And we knew that suddenly this long-term approach of the government health service providing everything was going to become different, and that different providers would be competing for contracts to do this. And we thought, why would anybody pay for a service that's inequitable and that can't show the benefit of what it's doing and that looks different in different places? So we needed to have a think about this. The result of this discussion and this reformulation and debate was to try to develop a framework that would help us to understand really a lot better the health and well-being needs of children and young people. What we realised was that until the age of about 5, we knew a lot about children and young people because there's much more surveillance, there's immunisations, there's regular development checks and things like this. But once children and young people went to school, we started to know very little. And that's from a rights point of view. That meant that a third of under 18s we knew a lot about, but it meant that 2/3 of under 18s or under 16s we knew virtually nothing. And yet allocation of resource was being based on very little evidence or information. Practice was outdated, priorities were wrong, and didn't meet what young people and children felt they needed or wanted, or indeed any of that. So we needed to develop a framework that would help us to understand this and could provide us with information on a regular basis that meant more things. It needed to be a way of engaging all children because they were not participants at all in any of the decision making or processes that were involved, and that was wrong. It was wrong and it was also ineffective. We needed to find a way to understand what was happening in a way that allowed us to intervene earlier and provide support in ways which was more helpful and at an earlier stage. And we also needed to find a way to collect information that would help to evidence the effect of other programs that were happening in the area as well. Governments of all kinds spend an awful lot of money on different services and programs, but usually with very little evidence and very little engagement of the people affected most. And we needed to try and find a way to change that, and this was an opportunity. The thing I forgot to add to that was that whilst we were tasked with this challenge of creating a different type of framework that would apply to all children in all schools, we were also told there was absolutely no budget for this exercise whatsoever, and we would have to find all the resources for the development and implementation and reconfiguration of how we worked within our existing framework. So sometimes there's a perception that changes and developments in high-income countries are because there's always money, and I can assure you that's not the case most of the time. So the model that was developed was something we called school health needs assessment and response process, it was really important that response was included in the framework, because otherwise there was a danger we would have a process that simply collected information and did nothing with it. And that was to betray the involvement and trust of children and young people, and was simply not meet the purpose for which it was designed. It was a model that could be applied to, and was applied by school public health services, so these are primary healthcare services within the government health service, but in collaboration and in partnership with schools, communities, and other groups. It's a very simple process. It begins with collecting information, and information that's collected is from the schools themselves: what's working, what's not, what do they perceive to be the main priorities. Local public health data, what already exists, because sometimes we don't use what there already is. In the case of children and young people, not a lot, to be honest. Professional experience, but primarily and most importantly, information gathered from children and young people themselves. So, and this means not a sample, this means children and young people from two particular year groups. That's year 10, which is, year 6, which is 10 and 11-year-olds, and year 9, which is 13 and 14-year-olds, in all schools in the area. And that was about 500 schools we're talking about. Beyond that, to have a process whereby that information was collated and analysed, and that resulted in two primary outputs, two primary purposes. The first one was that individual children and young people could be identified for additional help and support if they wanted it. And the second was that we would start to build a picture at a local level, but aggregated to a larger level around health and well-being needs of young people. This is all young people, but disaggregated by different groups, different genders, different sexual identities, different ethnicities, and different areas across our area, across our patch, which could start to better inform service responses, public health decision-making, allocation of resource, and start to enable the priorities identified and experiences of children and young people to influence that in a way which was very hard to achieve before. Start to provide meaningful, concrete data on an annual basis. Whenever you're trying to advocate for your children and young people, particularly groups whose voices are seldom heard before, it's often anecdotal. And that's okay, and that can bring about change too, and it's important. But in other decision-making forums, when you're trying to compete for resources with other areas, then actually hard data speaks in a different way, and it changes a conversation sometimes in a way which we didn't have before. So this approach was applied in all public schools on an annual basis, including and involving around 30 to 35,000 children and young people every year. That creates a lot of data and allowed us the opportunity to then look at that in a little bit more detail. But the reason I wanted to show this to you was because this was a practical, implementable approach that can be used to collect ongoing data within a mainstream health service and a mainstream government health and education service. We decided to look a little bit more closely at the findings because, as a public health person, we're interested in where inequities lie. I know we have a particular focus here on LGBTQ young people, but our interest was in looking for marginalisation and inequity across all areas of children and young people's life. All right. Thank you. We knew from conversations and from qualitative findings that children who were LGBTQ were likely to have poorer experiences. That's not new. All the data shows this. But there was limited evidence from a UK context, and this was an opportunity where we had a large sample of young people to try and look at that in more detail. So what I'm going to show you just what we found. So this is from a group who are 13 to 14 years old. Just to give you a little understanding of how these tools were developed. These are simple questionnaires. They are asked very short, as Liz mentioned before, these have to be short when they're used within school settings and when they're used at scale. They ask about a very wide range of health and well-being, experience of health care, access and utilization of services, health behaviors, a very wide range of issues in a very small number of questions. It doesn't have the luxury of the detail and focus that a specific research can do, but what it did have the benefit of was coverage. So whilst it wasn't perfect in any way and remains crude, it was an approach that allowed us to reach on a continuous and cyclical basis to young people in all settings. The tools and questions themselves were generated from other validated tools, and they were contextualized to the setting and language used by young people in our area. Where there wasn't tools, we had to create them and test them. But we had a participatory and multi-stakeholder process to review these tools every year when revisions were made and other questions were added in. So within the confines and constraints of how we operated, it was a reasonably structured, rigorous and consistent and participatory process. Our sample for this particular data set was just over 8,000 13 to 14-year-olds. And that's about 70%, just under 70% of all 13 to 14-year-olds that live in this area. So when it comes to being representative, it's a big chunk of the population, and actually in terms of ethnicity and other characteristics, we felt was pretty representative of the population as a whole. In terms of actually what happened to young people completing these tools, again, these were completed in the school setting. Always, because this was an ongoing process, there was always challenges around that with privacy. We talked a lot with young people about this, but the majority said that they felt that they were frustrated by that, but actually we worked closely with schools to try and ensure as much privacy as possible. The school system themselves had no vision over the answers or the questionnaires at all. This is essentially a contract of trust between young people and the government health service, and we build on, in some respects, a kind of a legacy of trust around that. Young people said they were comfortable with that. We would love to move towards digital in the way that Liz talked about before, and that is happening now, but at this point in time that wasn't a possibility. What we found from this sample was that the number of, or the proportion of LGBTQ young people was about 4.5% to 5% of the total population. And we were fairly reassured by that, because that was something that seemed to be within the ranges that our public health body in the UK, Public Health England, felt was in keeping with what we would expect. The findings we knew would be stark, and we knew would be very different for this group compared to sexual majority children and young people. But I don't think most of us didn't really quite appreciate quite how big those differences would be. And so these are a few years younger than the sample in Liz's study, but already their experiences are marked and extremely different. And we can see that in terms of bullying, self-harm, loneliness, hope, optimism, experience of violence, the odds ratios and the difference in experience of young people across our region was markedly different. Where also, but we didn't. So that's why I thought it was useful to share. And when I remember when we shared these with colleagues here in FLACSO, they said we have nothing in Argentina that can also help us to understand our position here as well. What we also found was that when we looked at young people's findings across other domains as well, we had these very stark inequities in findings that we expected, but we also found stark findings across other domains. So it wasn't only areas of mental health or isolation or or bullying, where young people had different lives. In their physical health as well, they were much more likely to perceive differences in altered body weight. There were differences in their diet. There were differences in elements of reported chronic ill health. And sadly, also, and paradoxically, they also had worse experiences of health services as well. So the young people who arguably had some of the greatest needs also felt that their rights and their experiences when they used routine healthcare were poorer. They didn't feel listened to, didn't understand what was said, just fundamentally had a poorer experience. As you said, this is a very imperfect environment. It's a real environment, and there's lots of limitations that go alongside that. Couldn't control the conditions in all the settings where this survey takes place, but it improves year on year. It's self-reported. It was based on the participation was based on the ability to consent, and not necessarily health literacy, and that would sometimes lead to a different interpretation of questions. Consent itself is also an interesting sort of point to mention, particularly when trying to do things at scale. Historically, in most health services, there's a lot of regulation, and it is in most countries, around the involvement of young people. To begin with, we had to get parental permission to include young people in this approach. We felt that was wrong. We felt that often excluded young people for whom we would really want to be able to participate, those with the most needs, and it was also fundamentally contrary to their own to their rights. What we did find was that we were able to use the UN Convention and articles of the UN Convention to successfully build a case with the legal departments in the government health service to waive that, so that young people could be deemed competent to consent to participate themselves. As I say, the thing that we thought was useful about this was that this was the first study that we've had of this kind in the UK. Despite the challenges and difficulties, when we did statistical testing to suggest acquiescence, it was very low. It suggested that most young people were honest or clear in their responses. And in terms of practicalities and in terms of implications, obviously we were able to publish this, so it's generated quite a lot of interest. At a local level, it's resulted in a complete change in approach to how health workers are trained, with more specialist services coming to support young people, and better training and awareness for staff. And it's become a real tool for advocacy in local authorities and municipalities to try and have a better understanding of this. So that's really just what I wanted to share with you. I just thought it was interesting in the context of this particular meeting, and it complemented a little bit of what Liz was saying before.
Muchas gracias, Andrew. Está abierto el espacio de intercambio. Para eso le vamos a pedir a Carlota que asuma el rol de facilitadora comunicacional. ¿Alguna pregunta en la audiencia? Esa misma comentario es para la gente que está conectada virtualmente. Y si no hay ninguna pregunta, voy a hacer una. Pido la... bueno, yo lo que quiero destacar es un aspecto que se dio esta semana en cuanto a la importancia de tener datos poblacionales. Que fue también un tema de debate, por lo menos intercambio también con Dora, en cuanto a esta relación entre lo que es el individuo y que para quienes venimos a la salud pública lo enfocamos dentro de lo que es la clínica y la salud pública, que es la salud poblacional, no es salud del sector público. Y en este caso, tanto en la presentación de Liz como en la de Andrew, nos muestran justamente la importancia de acceder a esta información, pero como dijo Andrew, pegarla a una respuesta, porque el modelo que presentó es un modelo similar a cualquier sistema de vigilancia epidemiológica que tiene un componente de ajustar información, pero para algo, para acceder. Esto en contraposición a lo que son nuestros modelos de salud escolar, en donde se junta mucha información para nada. Esta es una crítica, no lo voy a traducir para que no se entere nadie. Y la otra cuestión que tiene que ver con comparar lo que es el modelo de la encuesta global de salud escolar versus esta que es una encuesta de evaluación de necesidades para la acción. Y es un poco la pregunta que le quería transmitir a Andrew. What I'm saying is just to highlight the importance of gathering population-based information, that we feel that is something needed in terms of reorienting policies. But also what just want to ask you is just to make a sort of comparison between the Global Health School Survey and this one that is based on the school-based health needs assessment, in terms of this kind of response is much more based on the need of the population or something assumed by the state and the government in terms of reorienting policies. Any comment about this?
Yeah, I suppose only that you know, the motivation and purpose behind the development and sustained adoption of this approach in Lancashire, in northwest of England, was just primarily driven because there was a huge gap in intelligence and understanding about the lives and rights and needs of young people of school age.
Mm-hmm.
And that, you know, that was wrong from a rights perspective, but it was also highly inefficient and purposeless from a planning, a response of how health services and other education and support services should be configured and designed. You know, I think it was, from our perspective, it was a tool to try to have a more meaningful and more routine engagement, to be able to try and track that and involve children and young people.
Mm-hmm.
But also to enable better decision making and better use of resources, which are getting less and less all the time.
I think what Andrew has played down is that in the UK, what we don't have is population data that brings together health, school, education, and sexual orientation questions. So what was unique about Andrew's study is that it had all of those variables included within it. So the Global Health Survey, there's nothing about sexual identity. Yeah. So that was the uniqueness of it.
Monica?
Right. It seemed to me that there was a greater gap between majority and minority regarding their needs and the way in which they answered that they had been heard and treated and understood things. It seemed to me it was. Would you agree that that means that you're being well evaluated in the sense that the health services responding to their needs, or am I clear? Am I making myself clear?
That's not how we interpreted it at the time, to be honest. The degree of gap is different. I agree, but I think we took it. We took it that there was a lot more that needed to be done, and a lot more listening and change that needed to occur, and a lot more direct engagement with young people to help us do it better, basically. But I think the scale of inequity that was being evidenced was very powerful and still is. This is relatively recent. This is a yearly thing that's collected, but having the opportunity to collate it in that way doesn't happen as often. So yeah, it's been quite a powerful tool. But I think as Liz says, one of the things that was particularly helpful was the linking of the two together, and that for us being able to do that outside of a research confine, there's sometimes quite a gap between research environments. There shouldn't be, and it's not really a problem of the researchers, but it's perceived it within services. So being able to have something to collect that on an ongoing basis was very helpful.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Andrew. Y llegó el tiempo de Alex. This is Alex time.
Okay, so how's that? Can you hear me okay? Okay, so the focus of my presentation is a little bit different.
So as we all now know, our focus is on this project that we're working on we're interested in young LGBTQ people's mental health as this relates to schools. And part of that process is thinking about how we engage young people in research. So thinking about that process today, I'm going to be talking about some different ways of involving children and young people in research. Specifically the benefits and challenges of doing this kind of work. And I'll be doing that by drawing on some examples of research projects that have been conducted at Lancaster University by myself and colleagues. So any questions about their projects at the end, please direct to them. Okay, so I think just to start, the important question is, sorry, yeah, it's because I kind of like to see at the same time. Okay, like that. Oh Lord, oh Lordy Lord. Okay. How's that? Sorry, it's just, yeah, I haven't got a screen, so yeah, it's hard to look. Okay, so the important question to start with is, why do research with children and young people? What is the rationale for doing this kind of work? Because, well, historically, the lived experiences of children and young people have been omitted from child-related health research. However, it is increasingly now acknowledged that children and young people can make a valuable contribution, and that research should be done collaboratively with children. So the emergence of these kinds of participatory approaches, they draw on a wider sociological movement that reflects changing perspectives about children's status in society. And this has then followed on to lead on to increasing involvement of children as participants and as co-researchers in research projects. Okay, so child or youth-led research is often predicated upon two concepts, power and emancipation. And the emancipatory paradigm argues that power is a fundamental aspect of all research relationships. And it would also challenge the legitimacy of research which does not empower groups who are invisible or oppressed. So in the context of our focus, this would argue that the interests of children and young people as a relatively powerless group are best served when they set their own agendas and lead their own research. And parallel experiences can be traced in feminist research and in disability studies. And so really these approaches seek to deconstruct positivism and replace this with empowerment and the voices of disempowered or invisible groups. So this particular critique would challenge the legitimacy of research done into children's worlds and children's life experiences, where the research is conceived from a wholly adult perspective or adult-centric view. So there's been different models that have been used to conceptualize how adult researchers should do research with children and young people, and all have different criteria for what counts as participatory research. So early models, can't work out the light, but the early models, okay, I'm just going to use it like that. So the early models emphasized a hierarchy in terms of types of participation. So here we have Hart's ladder of participation. However, they have since been critiqued for being too hierarchical. So we've got the higher levels of participation at the top and the lower levels being considered of less value. And the argument is that actually, when we're doing participatory research, sometimes it's about looking at, what type of participation is best for the situation. So we have here a different model of participation, which thinks more in terms of degrees of participation, and the idea that they should be, they have equal value. But so it has been argued by some that some of the types of participation here can be actually quite just tokenistic or consumerist, and therefore this has led theorists to think about, think critically about the design and implementation of participatory projects and what kinds of participation have value. So benefits and limitations of doing participatory research are well documented, so I'm not going to talk about them today. But less attention has been paid to the process of participation itself, and all of its messiness and messy dynamics. So, so in an attempt to kind of capture some of this process and this messiness, I'd like to focus today on the process of participation itself in research as this relates to children and young people. And as I said, I'll be drawing on some examples from research conducted by myself and colleagues at Lancaster University. And so in doing that, my aim here is to critically reflect on some of the ethical, practical, and methodological challenges of doing participatory research with children and young people. And also then to conclude with some key lessons that we have learned based on our collective experiences. So the first study was led by Dr. Mark Limmer at Lancaster University. And the aim was to develop a model to effectively involve young men in all stages of the research process. So that was from defining the research question to also writing up and publishing the results. And this was achieved by recruiting 2 young men to work with a small research team investigating aspects of young men's use of online pornography. And for this study, all aspects of the research were designed and undertaken by all members of the team. And the 2 young men involved in this research were able to provide their experience, expertise, and perspectives. I forgot to ask for photos for this, so I just took some on my own. So I hope they seem fitting and not too much for the morning. Okay, so here are some reflections on how this process went in reality. And it was felt that despite all best efforts, it was actually quite difficult to meaningfully overcome some of the power differences within the group. And so in the end, it was just felt that actually it was necessary just to accept those power differences and work on a model which recognised everyone's expertise as different, but also as valued equally. So there were ways in which that the research project could equalise some of these relationships or go to some way to trying to do that. So for example, the research team gave responsibility for calling and chairing the meetings to one of the young men. And this did help to a certain degree to equalise some of those relationships.
I have a question. I'm a bit lost. Where is the intergenerational component of this study? Because intergenerational, in the previous slide, there was intergenerational. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know where that. Yeah, okay. I'm sure I must have covered it from. Yeah, I don't know how I got that. Sorry. Yeah, research on young men's perceptions of pornography. This is what happens when you use other people's research. So yeah, no idea where the intergenerational bit came from.
Okay.
There you go. Okay. Where was I? But it's good to clear that up, really, isn't it? So yeah, okay. So there were things that could be done to equalise the relationships, but it was power dynamics were difficult to overcome. However, the involvement of the young men did result in tangible differences in terms of the outcomes of the study. They reshaped the research questions from the outset, and they also planned and delivered the group work in a different way to perhaps would have been done otherwise. They coded the data differently, although, as you said, Mark, not actually hugely differently to how the academic researchers did. But importantly, they did assign different meanings to the coded data. Problem, I suppose, here would be that this model of real involving young men from the outset is that actually this would be quite difficult to replicate in a fully funded program. The focus for this study was much on the methodology as the empirical work, and therefore there was less pressure on results and outcomes. But obviously this is not always the case in funded research. So if you're trying to adopt this kind of deep participatory approach in your research, it's worth considering the time and cost implications of doing that. Okay, so this is the second example. This study was led by Professor Elizabeth Dermott, and the fieldwork was conducted by Rachel Eastham at Lancaster University. And this research sought to explore, hopefully I've got the title right, yeah, good, very good. It was to explore how family relationships foster, maintain, or harm mental health and well-being of LGBTQ youth. So this involved face-to-face or online semi-structured interviews with 12 LGBTQ young people aged 16 to 25. And these interviews were also received, got some pictures here, were complemented by a visual activity, which used pens and paper and stickers to map out the young person's experiences and who they considered to be their family and the nature of those relationships. So that was the study. So reflections from again how that process worked in practice. The purpose of using these more creative and visual methods was through the researchers' attempt to conceptualize young people as agents in their own right, rather than just as passive objects of research. And this was done in order to minimize the power imbalances again and the disconnect between adult and youth. So the literature, we know that visual methods can be an engaging and inclusive research method. One thing I've found is that often the benefits of such methods are uncritically assumed as like the gold standard of any participatory research project. You know, it's kind of equals participation. But yet Rachel found when she was conducting the fieldwork that actually some of the young people felt quite inhibited and anxious by taking part in this kind of activity. They tended to withdraw from it, and actually that had the opposite effect of what was intended. This was supposed to be a way of including and engaging young people, but it wasn't doing that for everyone. So she felt that it was really important to stress that if you're going to use these kind of activities in your participatory work, that to stress to the young people, they don't have to do it, they don't have to participate. They can just talk or write if they prefer. There are other ways of communicating. And I think we would all recognise here that this has to do with the fact that the label of young person by no means signifies a homogenous group. We've got there are a diverse range of individuals with their own needs and interests, and also for this importantly, their own ways of communicating, their own preferred ways of communicating. So when you're designing participatory research projects, the problem can be is if you're creating it as a visual-based study, or that's a real key component of your design, to think about how maybe you also incorporate other methods to ensure that people are given that option to communicate and express their experiences in a variety of ways. Okay. The final study doesn't include children and young people as participants or co-researchers. But I'll hopefully, when I talk, you'll understand why I've chosen to discuss this study today. So this study was led by Mark Limmer, and the research was conducted by myself. So the fieldwork was conducted by myself and my colleague Rachel Easton, all at Lancaster. So this was a Department of Health funded project which sought to explore the lived experience of gastrointestinal infections, so GI, so tummy bugs, stomach flu, yeah, that translates, for families living in northwest England. So the rationale for this study was that the evidence tells us there is a link between deprivation and risk of GI for families with young children. And the purpose of this particular study, it was part of a wider programme of work, was that we wanted to gain a more in-depth qualitative understanding of this relationship. So for the methods, we conducted 21 interviews with families of young children aged 0 to 11 who had had a recent illness experience. And these interviews, again, we've got some pictures there. They included a creative map-making activity, and this involved the use of geographical maps, photos and pens and post-its to act as a prompt for discussion. We also have photographs as well, actually, as a prompt for discussion and to elicit some of the information about the social and material environment in which these experiences happened, both before and after the illness. So research ethics asks us as researchers to assess the balance of risk versus benefits when we're thinking about who to decide to include in our research as participants. And the Medical Research Council suggests that research should only include children where the relevant knowledge cannot be obtained by research with adults. So at the design stage of this study, it was decided that we would focus only on the parent or carer accounts, given the young, because some of these children were actually very young. And it was this decision to not include children as participants was deemed sound by the research team and also by the ethical review panel. So that was our starting point. So from that point onwards, we were conceptualizing the adult participant or carer as the only participant. That was the only participant in our study that we were focusing on. However, what we found again, what happened in practice, we found that firstly, if you're doing family-orientated or child-related health research, it would be quite unreasonable and unjust to assume that children won't be present. So, for example, in our study, many of the participants were women. They were primary carers of their children, and they cared for their children full time. So that led to the inevitability that children would often be present when we were organising times to spend for the interview. And again, so what we found then was children's presence during the interviews was quite a distraction. So parents being quite preoccupied with the interview and the activity that we were doing were often unable to safely attend to their child. So we had many cases of children starting to wander off, pulling things off shelves, generally causing trouble. And trying to manage all of that whilst also having this in-depth interview was quite tricky and sometimes compromised to safety. And also, so we were doing a map-making activity, like a creative activity, and some of the young children inevitably really wanted to be involved in that. They saw pens and stuff on the table. They wanted to engage in that activity, and that was, again, a hindrance to the collection of our data. Older children would actually, their desire to engage was a bit more constructive. So actually sometimes they would come and they would be present, so they would want to contribute to the explaining of their experience. It was their experience we were trying to understand. And so this whole process led us to realise that actually the children had a really active role to play not only in the data collection process, but also our understanding of the phenomena in question. So just being in people's homes, seeing that dynamic, seeing that family relationship, they were there, they had presence, they had agency, and they influenced the knowledge that we produced, even though we had not included them as participants. So I think this really troubles our assumption that actually it was sufficient for the parent or carer to be considered as the only participant. And so really, I think what we felt was that when researching with families about a child-centered experience, it is actually quite important to look beyond the individual adult as a participant, and to conceptualize dependence as participants or like participants, like they were there even if we weren't directly speaking to them, and that could help to recognize their agency and presence during fieldwork. And I think so we concluded, based on this reflection, that actually, had we done this from the outset, had we conceived as dependents or children as like participants, they could have been more meaningfully considered at the research design stage, perhaps more safely occupied during the interviews, and perhaps more meaningfully included in our understanding of the research data that we were collecting. Okay, so just to summarize. So just in summary of some of the key lessons, I suppose, that I and others have learnt when engaging children and young people in research, was that firstly, power dynamics can be difficult to overcome, and so I think it's therefore best to be really open and transparent about this difficulty from the outset, and also by recognising that everyone's expertise is different but equally valued. The cost and time implications of including children and young people as researchers needs to be considered. And whilst the use of visual and creative methods can be inclusive and engaging, there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. So we shouldn't uncritically assume that approach is going to get what you want or you need from people. And finally, I guess from the last case study, all research that concerns children and young people should recognise children's presence and agency as like participants, even when they are not included as a source or collector of data.
Gracias, Alex. Y bueno, muy interesante la presentación. Así que abrimos el espacio para comentarios, consultas. Y esto mismo para la gente que está conectada a distancia. Comments, questions. Yo tengo mientras van pensando, una reflexión, que es la crítica que Alex hizo al tema de los métodos creativos participativos como el gold standard. Y esto mismo pasa en el ámbito de la investigación epidemiológica, en donde si no es un ensayo clínico controlado, este es el gold standard. Y hoy hay una crítica grande a lo que entendemos por el gold standard. O sea, tenemos que redefinir y repensar críticamente si el abordaje que estamos utilizando es el mejor para alcanzar lo que queremos, lo que queremos explicar o la realidad que queremos conocer. Bueno, what I'm saying is that what you are saying about the criticism about the gold standard using some kind of participatory research methods happens in the same way with the epidemiology considering randomized controlled clinical trials as the gold standard. So perhaps it's a good moment to question gold standards and to rethink which is the best method to approach or to explain what we want to explain. So just make comment.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think so. It's not only in terms of what's the best method from the outset, but then thinking again about this process and what that can tell you about a method. Because it's not just about the beginning and the outcomes, it's also about the bits in between. So I think it's really good to reflect on that and how that's working in practice. Yeah.
Carlota.
No, una reflexión también en relación con esto, que si, what if we're doing research to transform reality, not just for the intellectual interest, I think that start thinking in this methodology is also a way to change what Dikala was saying about how we produce knowledge and who is represented. And I think it's very important to really think out of the box and incorporate. And I think for our project is one of the more exciting things is to incorporate the voices, and the challenge also to incorporate the voices in their experience. But it's challenging because we have to move away from the power of we made all the decisions. But I think we're changing as we're learning and distributing power in a different way. And I think it will be very very interesting to see the products, because it's a process, it's the result, but it's also a process that we are doing.
Yeah, and I think, so I think just thinking about how we overcome some of these challenges, and then also, like I said, recognizing that sometimes we won't be able to, but reflecting on that and being open about that, what we could and could not do.
Adelante.
I was wondering if when working with children or small or adolescent groups, is it better to do it in a focus group kind of way, like a collective group thing, or maybe with the help of institutions at work, maybe schools or other places where children are already gathered, I could say? Or is it better to work it in an individual way with families, or I don't know, maybe in your experience, what is the best or the most recommendable way of doing it?
Well, I suppose maybe first off, in terms of the place, I mean, there's arguments for why you might not necessarily want to recruit children and young people via schools, and Liz, maybe you've got thoughts on that. About what, again, it comes back to that power dynamics thing, is if we're trying to engage young people in a meaningful way, you don't want to start from the position where you're recruiting them via schools. Maybe they feel like they have to, or they should, or maybe it's linked to their performance at school and how the teachers perceive them, those sorts of things. And then in terms of individual or focus group, I think that largely depends on what you're trying to find out, and there will be settings where it's more appropriate to have an individual discussion about an issue, but there'll be others where it's great to have young people kind of bounce off each other and think of ideas together and come up with solutions together, where a focus group would be an appropriate approach, I think. Yeah.
I think it really, really depends on the topic and the population group that you're talking about. So if you took school as an example, if you wanted to talk to them about, I don't know, bullying or stuff, and you're in the room, there is that school is, in the UK anyway, a very controlled, defined environment. So you will get young people talking in a very controlled, confined way if you used an interview or a focus group, for example. But if you actually want to know about bullying in schools and how it happens, some people in the UK, what they've done is a ethnographic approach or a walk alongside approach, where they walk with the young people around the school and look at and talk about where bullying happens, and then the control and the confines loosen up. Yeah, so it depends on, and generally when you use interviews, you're really talking about individual experience. And I think with with children, that's very difficult, like really young children. As young people, as you know, they get older, it's a bit easier, but still you are requiring the individual to intellectualize their experience, to remember their experience, they try to answer the question correctly. Yeah, so it can be so it's okay if it's about experience, but sometimes it's not the best way. But focus groups are often good for marginalized groups because the focus is not just on them. There's a group of you, and they're very good for solution-orientated type discussion. So I think it just really depends on what you're researching and being creative and understanding. Most importantly, it's understanding what young people's position is in society and then adapting your methods to try and address those power difficulties.
Acá tenemos una pregunta de Carlos Cáceres y a partir de su comentario queremos agradecerle a toda la gente que está conectada a la actividad, que aunque no la vemos, sentimos que están presentes, así que realmente valoramos mucho la participación. And Carlos Cáceres asks you, would you share any thoughts about how to research the sexual autonomy of minors, especially in light of existing and legitimate ethical concerns?
I feel like that's more Liz, do you fancy
Do you want me to read it again? In English? Es muy fuerte. Would you share any thoughts about how to research the sexual autonomy of minors, especially in light of existing and legitimate ethical concerns? Sounds English?
Now Spanish. I think for me there's a really two things really. One is about defining what we mean by minors and who we say we can collect information from, and then what information we collect. My sense is that you can collect information about things, so about what people think. So what do children as young as 4 or 5 or 6? It's very easy to ask them what they think about things. I think it becomes more problematic when you're asking them to talk about their experience. But I think in the UK we are incredibly reluctant to allow young people below the age of 16 to talk about their sexual experiences, because in the UK those experiences would be deemed illegal. But for most research, I think we really challenge that idea on the basis that it's really important that young people have agency and voice and be able to speak. And in fairness, in I don't know if it's the same in Argentina, but in the UK, the ethics committees tend to be fairly relaxed about being able to talk to young people between the ages of 13 and 16 about their own sexual experiences. And I just think it's really important that we reinforce that the need to hear those voices. We know that in the UK, I know the data for kind of heterosexual relationships, the average, by the time they're 16, on average 35% of young people have had a heterosexual experience. There's no point in waiting until people are 16 before we hear their voices. We have to do that earlier. And I challenge the idea that it's ethically difficult to get ethical permission. I don't think it's ethically difficult, because young people will tell us what they want to tell us, as long as we don't push them into positions to do anything otherwise. So if they feel comfortable to tell us some things, they'll tell us. If they don't, they don't. But if they tell us, then I think it's our responsibility to listen to that voice.
Muy bien. Estamos llegando al momento del cierre. No voy a decir despedida porque las despedidas me ponen triste. Así que un pequeño comentario con respecto al tema de la participación, que le voy a resumir. Es que para nosotros el tema de la participación es un tema central. Obviamente hablar de participación en una cultura en donde hay una cultura democrática instalada por siglos y confrontarla con nuestra realidad en América Latina, en donde los procesos participativos fueron interrumpidos por las dictaduras, adquiere un valor importante. Y un poco retomo las palabras iniciales de Alex, y con esto cierro, en cuanto a que el punto de partida de las investigaciones participativas con chicos tiene que ver con el poder y con la emancipación, o sea que ojalá que en nuestro país todos los chicos y chicas que nazcan lo hagan en un clima de empoderamiento y de emancipación, o sea, esto hace también a pensar una sociedad distinta, ¿no? Que es un poco el sentido de nuestra actividad del día de hoy. What I'm saying is that the value of participation is different in the UK and compared to Latin American countries, considering that our democratic processes were interrupted